We are going to hear from Steve Hayward, who has written of the age of Reagan and is a great historian and student of that period. We're going to hear from Sam Donaldson, who was the chief correspondent who covered the White House and who I think came to know Reagan as thoroughly as any person in the news business in the country, and he has a lot to add to this. We're going to hear from Michael Barone, who is one of the wisest students of American politics and whose book, Our Country, is one of the finest histories of modern America, and just a remarkably brilliant writer whose study also of the first revolution, I must say, if he wants to, in passing, get into the 18th and 17th century, or this 18th century rather. We would love to hear from Michael about almost any topic he likes to talk about, actually in late 17th century. So he might be able to relate Locke to Reagan. And finally, Craig Shirley, who was an activist in that period, was deeply involved in the movement, has been a leading conservative activist for years, and whose volume one in looking at the Reagan 76 campaign is really worth studying in terms of just the rise of Reagan and what he and his team were doing. And I, among many others, are looking forward very much this fall to the publication of Volume 2, which I'm sure he'll manage to briefly mention on the way through. But let me start by yielding to Steve Hayward to give us his thoughts on Reagan.
Okay, well, thank you.
We're very fortunate to have Craig Shirley here today. Nobody has studied more carefully Reagan's rise to national power and the way in which Reagan campaigned and the process by which it occurred. And we're delighted you could be here, and you should get in a brief plug for your upcoming book.
I think you covered that. Thank you. Thank you, Newt. Thank you to the AEI for the privilege of joining you here today. Recently, historian Douglas Brinkley, who edited the Reagan Diaries last year, remarked that the realm of Reagan scholarship is only now beginning to open up. So far, more than 900 books have been authored about this fascinating American, and more are coming this year, including Stephen's book on the second half on the Reagan presidency, and Marty and Annalise Anderson's book on Reagan and national defense. And, of course, the new and important documentary put together by Newt and Callista and Dave Bossie will only add to that body of knowledge about Reagan. Still, more is yet to come, and all will be welcomed not just by conservatives searching for answers, but by historians, Republicans, Democrats, and all who want to learn more about the man. Another historian, the late John Patrick Diggins, said was one of the 4 greatest presidents in American history. Reagan's legacy must be protected from some wishing to maybe trivialize it. There was an article in the Washington Post several days ago covering a young Martha Washington, and the Post reporter described the first first lady as, quote-unquote, hot. A revisionist historian who was described in the story, Patricia Brady, said that one of Martha Washington's early suitors was, quote, a hunk who was clearly sexually excited by her. As my daughter might say, this is just too much information. Reagan took his philosophy and his offices seriously, and I think we owe it to him to follow his lead. Yet for a new generation of Americans, Reagan is at best a faint memory, having left the presidency 20 years ago. What they do remember is 5 years ago, the astonishing outpouring of affection and love for the 40th President of the United States, not seen since the assassination of JFK. The question then is why? What bothered some while watching cable television the week of the Reagan funeral was that so many called experts seemed to only focus on his good humor, or that he liked to tell a good joke, or that he was a nice man. He was much more than simply this. Those musings miss so much, and that's why panels like this are so important, so that people can come to understand the essence of the man, the intellect of the man, the flaws of Ronald Reagan, and the courage of Ronald Reagan and how he changed our world. The books that came immediately in the wake of his presidency were almost all negative. Sleepwalking Through History was the name of one, Ronald Reagan the movie another, and Our Long National Daydream. They all 3 gave short shrift to the age of Reagan. But as Diggins wrote more recently in his own book, Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History, quote, Reagan had the imagination to envision a country without high taxes and the bureaucratic state and a world without the threat of communism. Now, we take these notions as a matter of course today, but as Newt will tell you, being there at the cutting edge in the 70s, this was revolutionary thinking in the late 1970s. Diggins was no ordinary historian. As a liberal professor at Berkeley in the 1960s, he saw and battled Reagan up close and in fact wrote a history of American liberalism entitled The Proud Decades. And yet in later years, Diggins came to appreciate Reagan, comparing him favorably to George Washington Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, all four he called liberators. Diggins also answers the question that has perplexed historians since the time of Henry Adams. Does the man make the times, or do the times make the man? Clearly, in the case of each of these four men, they altered the times they lived in. Each is remembered in his own way, unlike most other occupants of the White House. Washington was the father of his country. Lincoln freed the slaves. FDR lifted America and defeated Adolf Hitler. And Reagan restored American morale and won the Cold War. The scholarship investing in his writings, his speeches, his commentaries, and his interviews are helping us to better understand how deeply the man thought about things and how refined his philosophy of freedom was, and how much he believed in enlightenment and that a natural aristocracy of Americans could make the world over again. For those too young to remember the late 1970s, America was losing the Cold War to the Soviet Union. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, much of Central America and all of Southeast Asia had fallen to communism. Cuban troops were in Angola, Russian nuclear subs and infantry were in Cuba. NATO was falling apart, as Jimmy Carter, though a good man, was ill-equipped to understand, and as he admitted himself to Barbara Walters at ABC, that he didn't understand the intentions of the world domination of the Kremlin of the Soviet Union, even though every American president, going back to Truman, when he received the famous long telegram from George Kennan, that was exactly what the Soviets' intentions were. They were on the march, the Soviets, and frankly, some in the West welcomed this turn of events. George McGovern once complained that Eisenhower's Secretary of State, the hardline John Foster Dulles, had attempted in the 1950s to destabilize Warsaw Pact countries, as if this was a bad thing. The American economy was in an utter shambles, making the current situation look like a walk in the park. You think a temporary loss in the value of your 401k is devastating, but try losing the value of a dollar permanently through double-digit inflation that ran amok from 1977 to 1980, or interest rates topping 20%. Now, it wasn't just a matter of getting a loan, but it was, what was the point? Who could afford it? Gas lines snaked around blocks, and in some areas, when gasoline was available, it could only be purchased in limited amounts or on alternate days of the week. Under Carter, millions lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their savings, and along the way, lost their American spirit. Reagan vowed to change all this, and his history shows he did change all this, fulfilling the three goals he set for himself, his presidency, and the country. The 40th president has been often accused of living in the past, and was at that time, but what Reagan actually said was, quote, "I do not want to go back to the past. I want to go back to the past way of looking at the future." My own particular area of study of Reagan has been devoted to his political career, most especially his presidential campaigns of 1976, 1980, and 1984. Working on the books about the 76 campaign and the 80 campaign, I was able to combine and enjoy history, politics, and meeting and talking with people who had a role in that era, including Newt and Sam. I was also gratified to chat with Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, Jody Powell, Dick Cheney, former President Bush, John Sears, and many others. Unfortunately, one person I was not able to interview was rocker Alice Cooper, who was a Reagan supporter in 1980. When I called his office to ask for an interview, the agent replied it'd be useless because Alice wouldn't remember anything from that time. And I said, why? And the reply was, Alice was drunk from 1969 to 1983. And I said, you mean all of the time? And they said, yeah, pretty much.